there are lower areas of society where the average man has to confront with corruption really almost as a way of life. We discussed all these areas 2-3 days ago, and I don't intend to repeat them. So in the course of this entire agitation and the debate that it has thrown up in the last few weeks, we've also heard some not so complimentary statements made about Parliament and MPs. I would only urge my colleagues that our sense of maturity must compel us not to be provoked by any one of them. It's our actions and how we respond to them which will be the best response of Indian democracy to all these statements which are made. And when we decide, and today we are not legislating, we are only deciding the basic parameters of what should be the kind of integrity institution in India, which is the Lokpal, and we are also deciding as to which are the areas which must come within its scope and which should be kept outside. I think we must be guided by two basic principles. The first is that time has now come to raise the bar of accountability in Indian society. Routine structures have not succeeded till to date. They have not responded to the enormity of the challenge that we face. And the second is that when we think in terms of a scheme how to deal with it, we don't overreact or go in for knee-jerk reactions where we find solutions which are not consistent with our constitutional scheme. And therefore, even though I don't think in this case we are legislating in haste, we must remember that we must be guided predominantly by two vital considerations, which is the need for probity and the need to coexist with the constitutionalism as far as India is concerned. Sir, the whole concept of Lokpal was first borne out when the Administrative Law Commission, Reforms Commission, in 1966 had recommended the establishment of a Lokpal and a Lokayukt bill. In fact, it is very little known that at that time the bill was actually introduced in 1968 by none other than Shri Y.B. Chavan. And while introducing the bill, the statement of objects was, and reasons was, that the efficiency and integrity of public services should be kept in mind. So this whole question of citizens' charter or public grievances is not a new concept which is being brought into the system today. This was a part of the concept which was recommended by the Administrative Law Commission, Reforms Commission,
Yes.
way back in 1966, and the 1968 bill, 1st May 1968 to be precise, which Mr. Y.B. Chavan introduced. This concept was very much there. It had two concepts, and that perhaps may help Mr. Pranab Mukherjee to find an answer to the questions he has raised before us. Public grievances were a part of it. The concept of Lokayukt in the states was also a part of that 1968 bill. It's not something which has now been taken out of the hat and suddenly we are confronted with. In fact, in the report which Mr. Pranab Mukherjee himself authored in 2001 as the chairman of the Standing Committee, there's an important preface which I must read to my distinguished colleagues here. The term Lokpal, and I'm quoting from the report, is the Indian version of the Ombudsman. Ombudsman is a Swedish term meaning one who represents someone else. In other words, the term means a grievance man. Ombudsman is an official who is appointed to investigate complaints against administration. More specifically, he is an officer who investigates the complaints of citizens of unfair treatment meted out to them by government departments and suggests remedies thereof if he finds that the complaint is justified. Now, this ombudsman word was a Scandinavian concept. And coincidentally, on 3rd April 1963, then an independent young member of the Loksabha, Dr. L.M. Singhvi, in the course of his participation in India, attempted to find out what the Indian equivalent could be. And this word Lokpal was added to our vocabulary, the Hindi vocabulary, by Dr. L.M. Singhvi, who translated this word. Now, it's a coincidence that his very distinguished son, Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, now has to prepare the final draft of his bill. And I am sure he will keep in mind the great heritage, not only his personal but also of this concept, and strengthen this bill in order to maintain this, this very strong heritage as far as this bill is concerned. In fact, Dr. Singhvi's, that is the senior Dr. Singhvi, his definition was the term Lokpal and Lokayukt was coined by Dr. L.M. Singhvi as the Indian model of ombudsman for the redressal of public grievances. Now that answers one of the questions you have squarely raised today as to what should be the width of the activities as far as the Lokpal in India is concerned. Now this bill, which was first introduced by Mr. Y.B. Jawan, was actually passed by the Lok Sabha in 1969. This fact is mentioned very rarely in our present discourse. But because of the split in the Indian National Congress then, the Lok Sabha was dissolved soon thereafter, and the Rajyasabha could not pass this bill. Otherwise, this country would have had, but for that split of 1969, a Lokpal Act way back in 1969-70, and the entire series of events which have taken place in the last few months would have been really unnecessary, because we would have gone about strengthening this institution from day to day. So when I said that we must not legislate in haste, I don't think we are legislating in haste. We worked on 9 different drafts of this bill in 1942. Democracy cannot be so lethargic a system that it takes 42 years to really develop a consensus as to what a bill should be. We've almost discussed, debated every aspect of this bill. Whether a Prime Minister must be covered by Lokpal, whether he must not be covered by Lokpal. These are all areas which we have sufficiently covered. And I think time has now come that this whole concept of Lokpal at center as an effective institution and Lokayukt in the states now becomes a hard reality as far as India is concerned. So before I come to the specifics, and I think today's debate is not, and it should not be on generalities. The finance minister in his opening statement has said that earlier there were 6 questions which he had posed to political parties. And now there are 3 questions which need to be addressed by each. Was the first, where the sense of the House can be taken. And therefore the need for today's debate is not that we generally express ourselves in generalities and say, well, India needs a Lokpal and it must be a strong and effective Lokpal. But when it comes to the specifics, the nuts and bolts of what that Lokpal provision should be, we skip that part of the debate. I think today, all of us have to respond to this challenge which the Indian society is posing before us. And that's the strength of Indian democracy. And we have to respond to each one of these questions which have been raised, not merely by the civil society, but by the people at large today. We must not unnecessarily get into a position that there is a situation of parliament versus civil society. So there are 2 basic principles we have to keep in mind when we legislate. In any developing society, in any mature society, there will be a role for civil society. They are a hard reality, they will exist. Some of them may take positions which seem a little excessive, which may not be implementable. But then we must realize that their role is one of being a campaigner, a crusader, a flag bearer on several issues. They rise and try and compel the decision makers to change their views and come on track with their kind of opinion. We have the option of agreeing with them, we have the option of not agreeing with them. The second principle we have to bear in mind is, and this nobody can dispute, that Indian Parliament is supreme when it comes to lawmaking. Laws can't be made anywhere else except in the Indian Parliament. So even when pressure groups build up pressures in the society, we must concede to them the right to build up pressures, but not be provoked by them. We must not lose our sense of rationality as to what we are to accept, what we are not to accept. And we must legislate keeping in mind the basic principles and the values of Indian society, both from our traditions, both from our administrative experiences of our democracy, as also our constitutional values. And this is what we are going to endeavor today. What we must not do is to engineer a kind of a confrontation either between parliament and civil society or government and civil society. The maturity of Indian polity is that we must not allow ourselves to get provoked. And therefore, we must still keep all rationality in mind and therefore legislate accordingly as far as these principles are concerned. Sir, there are several questions that the Honorable Finance Minister has raised, and I hold his statement. I'll first come to the original 6 questions that he had raised. One of the questions he says is, should a single act provide for a Lokpal in the center and Lokayukt in the states? I think you have to answer this question keeping 2 factors in mind. There is a need for Lokpal in the center, a strong Lokpal, and there is a need for a strong Lokayukt in the states. The appointment of Lokayukts in the states will not be made by the center. It will only be made by the mechanism as far as the states are concerned. So that mechanism must be a state mechanism. Under no circumstances must center be seen as appointing or interfering in the Lokayukt of the states. Now, the recent incidents have actually brought a bad name to the institution of Lokayukt, where in one of the states we find that the elected government is completely bypassed and a Lokayukt is appointed. Now, we must, once these kind of, once these kind of events take place, then a question will arise in various minds. Is someone going to use or misuse the institution to fix its political opponents? Once we succeed in conveying that, and recent events have conveyed that, that probably will lead to the death of the Lokpal institution even before it is created. Because its credibility will be gone, the purpose of its creation will be defeated. So we must refrain from doing that and not treat this as an adversarial exercise. What is a Lokpal or a Lokayukt supposed to do? When a complaint comes that some public servant or a minister or a civil servant has indulged in a misconduct, he has to examine the evidence. He then has to peruse the evidence and decide whether it's a case of misconduct, whether it's a criminal offense or an offense which involves an administrative action. This requires assessment of evidence. Assessment of this evidence can be done by people who have a fair mind. Anybody whose appointment is brought in with a motive, or anybody who's not well versed in the art of assessing evidence, whose investigative or judicial, quasi-judicial abilities are a suspect, will not be able to do that.